10. Print Hello World. 20. Go to 10. Welcome to the first episode of the Hello World podcast. My name is Sean Wildemuth. I'm your host. The Hello World podcast is where you can hear from some of your favorite developers, authors, and speakers about how they got started in this business. We go way back to their first computer, their first piece of code, their first job. I'm really excited today because I got to talk to Jeremy Likness. He's a principal consultant over at Wintellect and a friend of mine here from Atlanta. He has 20 years of experience building enterprise applications and these days specializes in building web-based solutions using the Microsoft stack and client technologies like TypeScript and AngularJS. He's a 4-time Microsoft MVP, the author of several books on XAML technologies like Silverlight and Windows 8.1, and speaks frequently at user groups and conferences. He lives in Woodstock, Georgia, with his wife, daughter, 3 dogs, and a parrot. He's going to talk to us a bit today about how he got started, what was his first computer, and what he enjoys about software development. Here's the conversation I had with Jeremy. How'd you get into this game? How did you get into development?
So it's actually a little bit of an interesting story, maybe more so to myself than other people, but I literally blame it on the sunshine in the Florida beach. I got started in development when I was 7 years old, and the whole reason I got started was that we had a computer in the house, and I went out to the beach. I hated sunscreen. It was thick and nasty back then. They have much better sunscreen these days. And so I didn't wear any, and I ended up giving myself a pretty bad burn. So I ended up having to stay home, and my parents were working, and we had this computer and no games for the computer. So I was bored out of my mind and decided, well, I'm going to figure out how to make a game on this thing. So I pulled out the manual and tapped in my first basic program, and from that point forward, I was completely hooked.
And what computer was it?
That was a TI 99 4A. So,
wow. Not even a real keyboard.
Not even a real keyboard, not even a full, it was one of those 32-column screens where most of the other ones had at least made it to 40 columns. And, I only did BASIC on the TI 99, but very soon after that, we got a Commodore 64. And that's where I think the real programming skills kicked in when I started to learn how to do machine language and assembly on the Commodore.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, I remember programming the TI-99 briefly and remembering that space was significant and that it still bugs me today.
It does. The main thing I remember, I know the first game that I wrote was a choose your own adventure, which is really easy to write in BASIC. If they respond with this, go to this line, otherwise go to this line. But the main thing I remember spending literally, I don't know, it seemed like hours, it may have been minutes, but listening to that hissing, scratching sound as I was saving it off to the tape recorder, loading it back in later on.
That's very funny. And so you started writing software for the Commodore 64 and doing some of the machine language there. Were you writing games still, or what were you doing?
So on the Commodore 64, it was a combination of things. I got access to a lot of games, and at the time, there was this subculture of the demo scene, and they would do these things called intros and sort of advertise themselves when you got your hands on a game. And I won't talk about, if they were store-bought games or maybe another means for that at the time. But what would fascinate me was seeing these tricks where the developers would basically put patterns in a border that was essentially supposed to be a solid color or cause graphics to be drawn in parts of the screen that they weren't supposed to be allowed to draw. So that fascinated me to the extent that I would actually start to look at the code and break into, we had this thing called a machine monitor which is really dating myself, but you could get a cartridge and basically freeze the state of the machine and go inspect the memory. And so I would go in there and look at the code and see how they were performing these tricks. And I really coded just for the sake of pushing the envelope and figuring out how to get the Commodore to do things it wasn't supposed to do. For some reason, I loved doing that, and that's how I got into it. When I moved to the IBM PC later on in high school, I was really fascinated with math and had just gotten involved with chaos theory. So a lot of the programming I did there was dealing with plotting points and pixels and drawing fractals and basically applying those to the limited graphic resources that we had at the time.
And was that in high school?
That was in high school. And ironically enough, to kick off my professional career, so I say, the sun and the beach kicked off my knowledge of programming. My professional career was due to my Spanish speaking. So I was very much into computers, went to college for computers. And for a lot of reasons that would probably be boring for anyone who doesn't know me to get into, I didn't complete my first semester of college. I came home and I started out with a number of just odd jobs, working at fast food joints, bookstores, whatever, just because I didn't think I would be able to get a better job because I hadn't completed my degree. And I ended up accepting a job at a insurance company. And I was applying for a position that was just over minimum wage, and it was like $1 over, and I thought I was going to be rich because I was working at minimum wage at the time. And I happened to mention that I knew Spanish on the application. I'd taken several years in high school and went overseas and studied at the University of Salamanca for a summer. And because I mentioned that, they said, hey, wait a second, why don't you come over here to this other job, which was as a customer service rep, taking insurance claims over the phone in Spanish. And in that department, we were very competitive, and everyone was basically compared to each other based on how many of these claims we could close. And by closing them, meaning get all the information, get it complete, and get it over to the adjuster to take care of it. So being extremely competitive, when I would encounter a crash, instead of waiting for IT, which took forever, I would go in and try to fix the problem myself. And the IT department quickly caught wind of what I was doing and offered me a position on IT. They said, we'd much rather have you do this under our direction and managing the code than sort of hacking on it from a customer service terminal. And that's how I segued into doing professional programming on an old AS400, now called an I-Series mainframe.
So stack ranking in this first, customer service job really led you to start programming and getting paid for it.
And that's exactly right. And they say they're taking it away from Microsoft, but it's what launched my career, really. That's
interesting. That's interesting. And so you were in college a little bit. Did you learn any programming there, or was it really just you were hacking together, things you had learned from the Commodore TI-99 and the PC work you did with math?
So I learned a lot through interesting channels in college. So I formally took Fortran, and they had this cipher. It was called a mainframe that we code Fortran on. So I learned that formally. But informally, part of the reason why the university wasn't too excited about the use of my time there was because for a lot of the time, I would stay up all night on the terminals connected to the campus Unix machine and learned and taught myself C and C++. So it started out just using services like chat services and FTP. And the sysadmins quickly caught on to the fact that I was using up these resources that were shared across the campus. So they were shutting it down. So I said, if I could only figure out how to compile my own chat client and make it look like it's actually doing something important on the system, like a background process, then they'll stop bothering me. So I taught myself how to do that, built some clients, and ended up doing it so I could chat and spend all those hours and evenings on those computers. But the side effect was learning C++ on a Unix system.
And what year was this?
This would be 92.
92. Wow. Okay. Yeah, that the early parts of when the internet started to be, for people outside of universities and things like that.
Right. It was an interesting time. I remember returning home from college and trying to tell all my friends about this amazing thing called the internet, and they would kind of get a puzzled look. And so, what is this, like a BBS? You dial into it, you post. I'm like, no, you don't understand. This is different. So is it kind of like this America Online thing we heard? No, you don't understand. This is bigger than that. And it was kind of funny to think about being on that and plugged into it, really at a time when people had no clue what the potential of the internet was.
Sure. Yeah, I remember sitting with a college professor, and he was a college professor friend of mine, not my professor. And he was, lamenting about sort of, the uses that were starting to be used, to communicate documents and sort of the democratization of knowledge. And I was like, yeah. Oh, look, cute girls. He was trying to inform me way before I should have known about it, and I didn't want to hear it. Sort of the story of my development life, I think.
Yeah. Well, there's definitely some opportunities we all tended to miss or overlook. That's for sure.
And once you started working in that IT department, was that just the beginning of the career? Or did you ever go back to school, or?
So I did go back to school. I started working my way up through being a developer, and at the time specialized in that particular system, the AS400. So I went to night school, and that went well. I made really good grades and was getting close to getting a degree, and then my daughter was born. And so I stayed home, stopped going to night school to help out with her. And by the time we really got to the point where I felt I could go to night school again, my career had come so far in computers that I really felt like it probably wasn't worthwhile to try to go back, that if I did go back, it'd probably be for something like literature or archaeology or some other obscure topic that I know far less about than I do computers.
Well, this is actually an interesting topic for me. I've talked to a lot of people over the years about it. Kevin Pollak has a line. He says, I finished college in 3 months. They called it dropping out, but I was clearly finished. And that was kind of my experience with it was, I was working full-time writing software at the time, and trying to do both was just too difficult. And frankly, I was learning more not being in college. But over the years, I've sort of had this imposter syndrome because a lot of the guys I've worked with, who I've worked for, or that have worked for me, have degrees. And do they know things I should know? And all this other sort of stuff. Did that ever impact you, this idea of whether the degree was that important, or did you just have that confidence that you knew what you knew and that the degree was just a piece of paper?
Yeah, so I had that confidence, and I'll clarify that in saying, I have a lot of respect for people who do have a degree in that piece of paper, and there's certainly different paths. But for me, I never looked back. I felt like I had a knack for doing this amazing thing called programming. I could tell very quickly when I moved into a position that I was obviously able to figure things out a lot more quickly and in a different way than the peers around me. So instead of really worrying about going back and going through that formalized curriculum, I just ate up as much as I could in the workplace and used that as sort of my university hands-on. I found some great mentors in various companies that I was at that sort of showed me the ropes, and that was my education. And again, one of my goals, I would love to be a fiction writer. And it's interesting because a lot of my favorite writers actually have degrees in literature and in English. So I feel like, hey, maybe there's something to that in learning how to write a book for a reader. And that's probably something that I could go and gain some value from. But on the computer side, I think for certain people it's great, but for the path that my career took, it didn't fit at the right time, and I learned what I needed to know. And a lot of the skills that got me to where I'm at today were not even related to writing a program. They were selling skills and speaking skills and skills in areas that I think are tough to learn in a formal education.
I think that makes sense. So you mentioned early mentors. Can you tell me one of those experiences of what the kinds of things they taught you that you thought were important?
Sure. So I've had a few throughout the days. I remember at the insurance company, there was a programmer who took me under his wing. And as a mentor, he was more, I'll say, a technical mentor. He was really excited. At the time, the AS400 ran on a database called DB2, which was proprietary. And they were just embracing this thing called T-SQL. And you could purchase an add-on that would let you write SQL statements. And he was really looking at how this would revolutionize the way we would write some of our software, because a lot of what we did for month-end accounting was really massive SQL statements that at the time were written in code. And what that gave me was that sort of passion for learning something new, how to learn something new, how to experiment, test it out, do a proof of concept, and stay on the cutting edge. But I'd say one of my most impactful mentors was at the job I took after that, which was here in Atlanta in a small company some people may have heard of called Manhattan Associates. And I joined them at the time when they were a small private company. They're now multinationals, thousands of employees. But I got to work directly under one of the partners. And I can remember to this day, basically working on a project, struggling with the code, getting really stressed out, running into his office in a panic. And, he would say, I called these his wise sayings, because he would say something like, Jeremy, listen, everything you do is either reversible or irreversible. If it's reversible, stop complaining, go fix it. If it's irreversible, there's nothing you can do, learn from it, move on. And it may seem like obvious, but for me, it was like, wow, that's a great way to look at it. And then there would be something else where I'd say, oh, there's so much to do. And he'd say, look, an airplane, when they build the airplane, do you think they spend all their time on the thing that can happen 1 in 100 times, but is a minor inconvenience? Or do they focus more on the thing that can happen 1 in a million times, but could bring the plane down, right? You need to prioritize and focus on the critical pieces, get those done, worry about the small things later. And so he taught me just a lot about, looking at what I was doing, organizing my time, prioritizing my time, and those sort of soft skills that come around not being able to write code, but managing how you write your code.
Sure. That makes a lot of sense. Time management is something that I certainly didn't have early in my career, and took quite a while to figure that out. What about your code style? Did you learn that from anyone special? Did you model the way your code looked after other people, or was it just something that was something organic that happened?
It was definitely organic that happened. I'm not sure how much this plays into my coding style. I do believe that starting on the personal computers that ran at 2 megahertz, not gigahertz, megahertz, right? And then dealing with 64 kilobytes of memory always gave me a mindset of trying to do more with less and having the most compact code possible. So I picked up that discipline from writing very close to the iron. But I also think that having been through so many different languages was also a benefit. So I started out in 6502 assembly. I did the TI-99 basic. I learned Pascal in high school. I taught myself C++. I took Fortran formally. Then I learned RPG for the insurance company. I did some Lisp. So I had all of these different types of programming language. And I feel like every language picks up not just the rules and syntax of the language, but also helps you think in a certain way and solve a problem in a certain way. So if you can take that and apply it to the language you're working in, instead of being constrained by maybe the examples that you've only seen in that language, you can take some of those lessons learned from other patterns and other approaches and apply those to the language you're using them. So, I've always been very conscious about, not wasting code, right? Not writing a lot of code that does nothing, but getting value out of that code. But I also pay a lot of attention to looking at other code, especially with open source projects becoming so much more popular, being able to pull those down and look at things and say, hey, I really like the way this is done versus I don't. A lot of times when you look at the code and say, I like the way it's done, it's because you can understand it. And writing code that's understandable may not be as important if you're just a single developer working on a single project, but when you're on a team or you're leading a team or you're writing for a company that has a large IT department, that's paramount, right? Is that code that can be understood and maintained and utilized.
That makes sense. So you started in a period when a lot of code was there was before debuggers, right? Certainly the 6502 you wrote, certainly the TI Basic, and even some of the early programming languages you worked with. You couldn't just run the code, set breakpoints, and find out what was happening at that moment. You were doing some of that with the cartridge on the Commodore 64, but that was really giving you what's the word I'm looking for? A snapshot of what was happening in memory, right? You weren't really walking through code. So how does that impact how you deal with programming problems today? Are you someone that drops into the debugger as sort of the first thing? Do you like the idea of, code reading, being able to really understand code simply without running it? Where do you fall on that side of the fence?
So this gets back again to my mentor, but you are absolutely correct in writing the code on the TI-99, the Commodore 64. You really did have to be able to think about the code and look at it and run through scenarios in your mind's eye. I mean, there were tools that you could step through and do that, but a lot of the time it was what I call mental debugging. And when I was working for Manhattan Associates, my mentor there, he really, push that home, is that you need to learn how to look at code and not see what you expect it to do, but understand what it's really doing. And that's, there's a lot of games that you can play that show how the mind fools people. I know there's a popular one where you read a card and you count the number of F's on the card. And because some of the words are of, and most people count by sounding out in their head, they miscount because they're sounding out the of sound and they don't catch it as an F, for example. But that's an example where they're not following instructions. They're reading the card instead of looking at the letters and literally counting the letters. And code is the same way. Debuggers are great, but I think it is an art and sort of a lost art, really, to be able to look at code. And it happens on both ends, right? On one end, you have to go to write it, so it's easy to understand. But on the other end, you have to be able to grok it, if you will, to look at it and understand it. But when you have something going on in production, and if you don't have the luxury of having a massive IntelliTrace server that's capturing everything that's running, you're not going to be able to duplicate that environment. So if you can build your code in a way that you can really sit there and understand what's happening. So that's influenced the way I write code. I write code with the assumption that you're not going to be able to debug it when something goes wrong. And so that means using tracing, using console logging, using a lot of other steps so that I can basically make sure whatever environments it's in, you can troubleshoot it. And, obviously if you can get to a debugger, great. But that really has been my philosophy, is how can I write this piece of code in a way that if there's a production issue, you can troubleshoot it without having access to the debugger.
Interesting. I just write code that doesn't have bugs in it, so that, really solves it for me.
Well, that's what I'm working towards. One step above me, but I'm getting there.
Wow. Well, this has been really interesting. Thanks for sharing your story. Do you have any other tidbits, parts of the story that we didn't get to that you wanted to share?
Yeah, I want to share just what I think is a turning point, because I think a lot of people are probably going to listen to this who are either, they want to know how other people got to a point in their career. Maybe they're interested in making changes or pursuing their career on their own. And, when I started working at the insurance company, my first job was as a third shift operator. So I was working the night shift. And we had these massive print jobs where we had these printers that would print out thousands and thousands and thousands of policies. And every time you went from a black ink to a red ink to a green ink, you had to switch out the ink cartridge and run another print job. And so right away I was like, this is crazy. Why are we swapping this out? Let me figure out how to know what colors are needed, queue them up, and order them in a way, that I minimize how many times I'm swapping out ink. So I figured that out, got that done, and it took what used to take 6 hours down to a couple hours and freed up a lot of time for me to teach myself the other aspects of programming that allowed me to move from that shift into something else. But what was really key for me was I was still on the mainframe when I was at Manhattan Associates, and I found out about a new department that was working on the web. And I knew that, hey, mainframe's neat, it's a niche, but the web was the future. And so I did everything I could possibly do to move into that new department. And I actually had to have several meetings with HR because they were concerned, because at the time I had a management position, and I would have to lose that management position to go into the web team because I was, brand new, basically didn't have that hands-on web development experience. But I was like, hey, it's no problem. I mean, you're not going to give me drop my salary or anything, right? No, but you're not going to be a manager. That's fine. Let's go. Let's do it. So I was able to jump into the web very early. This was 96, and start working on enterprise web applications. And my point of both of those examples is that I think everyone, regardless of if they have a degree, don't have a degree, where they're at, sometimes I talk to people in development who feel stuck in development. A good example of that was when Silverlight rug got pulled out from under some people, and they felt like, wow, I'm stuck because I know.
Wait, Silverlight? What happened to Silverlight? Okay, go on.
Oh, in case you didn't get the memo, yeah, it's gone. And I saw a lot of people just really thoroughly torn up about that. And my point is that you can always learn a new technology and a new paradigm. You have to be willing sometimes to take a risk and maybe change your position, and you may have entrenched yourself someplace that's comfortable. But if you're willing to take that risk and kind of move with it, what you find is that the more times you kind of shift and turn with technology, which is changing fast and it keeps changing faster, right, the more capable you will be of picking it up and rounding out your career and kind of going and doing the things you want to do.
Well, that actually brings a question of mine, something I've been battling with, sort of in the same changes. I've been through a few of these cycles, a lot of these cycles where, the technology shifts happen. And there's always a group of developers out there who are worried about it going away. And one, nothing goes away. There are still RPG and AS400 developers. But I like to think of my job as my job is to learn, right? Whatever the new stuff is, or whatever, even if I'm not changing the technologies I'm using, I better be learning as I'm going, whether I'm finding better ways to do things. And, trying to eliminate that fear of, what if, what happened when OLADB went away and we were told to use ADO.NET instead, right? These big shifts, in my mind, are opportunities, not moments of fear and dread. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I agree. I've seen the shifts. I mean, I always joke with people, hey, the Commodore 64 didn't make it, right? IBM pushed it out. And then you had Apple, and then you had, so there's always going to be shifts. They're not going to change. And I agree with you. I think it's about learning and figuring out what you're passionate about and realizing that the tools of your passion may change, but the passion's still there. And so every language I've ever written, I've been passionate about and I've enjoyed. That doesn't mean that I like going back and doing RPG code or Fortran right now, but at the time it was exciting. And that's where I think people get stuck. They want to try to master a language. And it's a good start, right? It is a great start to learn how to master a language. But I think at some point in your career, if you really enjoy being a developer, you want to master programming. You want to master writing code, not writing code in C#, not writing code in Java, but literally writing code, architecting, taking an idea and using that as a canvas to make it a reality. And if you can focus on that, then you can handle the shifts. I mean, they'll come and they'll go, but you'll be able to ride the waves because it's always exciting to learn something new, and you'll always have something that you learn from that previous technology that you can use and apply to what you're doing in the new one.
That's a great philosophy as far as I'm concerned. But let's be honest, you are itching to get back into RPG.NET, right? I mean, that is a big part of your practice.
It's a pull. It's a pull. I feel it pulling, but I've got to stay focused on these other less interesting things like Angular and all this crazy JavaScript development that's just exploding right now.
It is. Well, thank you so much for joining me. This has been a great conversation. And, I appreciate you helping me out by being my first guest and guinea pig. We had a couple of technical problems in the beginning, but thanks so much. And thanks everyone listening. Thanks for having Jeremy Likness on my first show. And there'll be links to his blog, his Twitter out on the Magic Interweb.